guys. So we are starting social studies today. We're done with science for the year, and now we're going to do a couple chapters of social studies to finish out the year. The first one that we will be doing is on the Midwest. So we're starting on a new region. We've talked about the Northeast and the Southeast, and now we're going to talk about the Midwest. So go ahead and open your book to page 236 to the map of the Midwest. I also have it on the board. It looks like it's pretty hard to see, but hopefully you can see well enough to follow along in your textbook. So open up to the map on page 236, and then we're going to look at this to start our chapter on the Midwest. So let's find the key. Look at the key right over here, and we see that darker orange are the Great Lakes states. So let's find all of the Great Lakes states. We see Minnesota is that darker orange, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and Ohio are the Great Lakes states. We can assume that they are called the Great Lakes states because they all have a border. They all have at least part of their border that is one of the Great Lakes. Minnesota borders Lake Superior. Wisconsin borders a teeny tiny bit of Lake Superior and a lot of Lake Michigan. Illinois and Indiana both have a little bit of their border touching Lake Michigan. Michigan has Lake Michigan, Lake Superior, because if we look at Michigan, we see it's not just this piece, it's also this piece up here. So we see that Michigan has a border of Lake Michigan, Lake Superior, Lake Huron, and Lake Erie. So 4 out of the 5 Great Lakes border Michigan. Ohio also has a little of its border that is part of Lake Erie. So that is why they're called the Great Lakes states. Then we see these more yellowish states are the Plains states. So let's go and point out all the Plains states. We have North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, Missouri, and that's it, and Missouri. And we can see that we can assume that those are called the Plains states because they don't border the Great Lakes, and because most of the landform that we see most often in these states are plains. Now, some of them do have mountains, like North Dakota has some mountains, and South Dakota has some mountains, but for the most part, the rest of them are mostly plains. Now let's look at where else. So we see the state capital is the star. So what I want you to do right now is I want you to find and name the state capital of each state. I'm not going to do that because you can tell. You can find the star and then find what state it is the capital of. So I'll help you out. We see a star next to Bismarck. Bismarck is in North Dakota. So that means Bismarck is the capital of North Dakota. What I want you to do right now is pause this video and find the state capitals for each state in the Midwest. Remember, the little dots are not state capitals, those are just major cities. So if we go down to Kansas, we see, let's keep looking at North Dakota, because we see the star next to Bismarck for the capital, but then we see just a little regular dot next to Fargo, which that just means, and Grand Forks, which that just means those are major cities, but they are not the capital. So we do see some mountain peaks, so that means there are some mountains in these Midwest states. There's a mountain we have Mount Rushmore in South Dakota, which we know is a national monument that has the faces of the presidents carved into it. Where else do we have some major peaks? Let's see. I don't really see any other major peaks, but there are some other mountains in other places. There are actually some mountains and plateaus in Missouri. We can see that Missouri has a little bit of the Ozark Plateau in it. So there are some plateaus and some small mountains in Missouri as well. Now, remember we talked about canals. That's the next thing. That's this little line with some little tick marks on it. We talked about canals. Those are man-made waterways that make it easier to transport goods from one place to another, because back in the day when these canals were created, it was a lot easier to travel by boat than it was to take things by wagon or things like that. So let's see, we see a canal right along here, comes from Chicago and goes down into Illinois. I think that's the only one that we see here. Yes. Now we have national parks and national forests. There are several national parks in the Midwest. We have Theodore Roosevelt National Park up in North Dakota. We have the Badlands National Park in South Dakota. I really, really want to go there. If you look at pictures of Badlands National Park, it looks really, really interesting. Let's see, up in northern Minnesota, almost up to Canada, we have Voyageurs, which is, you say that in French, that's the French way of saying it, but I can't do accents. Voyageurs National Park. Let's see. And then up in Michigan, again, almost to Canada, is Isle Royale National Park. I feel like I'm missing one because I feel like I know of another national park, but maybe I thought that there was another one in Michigan, but I guess there isn't. And then we see quite a few national forests. Anywhere where you see the green that is kind of looks like crumpled paper is a national forest. Oh, we forgot Wind Cave National Park. Sorry about that. Wind Cave, that's near the Badlands. So we see all these national forests in the Black Hills of South Dakota, the Ozark Plateau, up here on the Upper Peninsula and into Wisconsin a little bit. That's what you call this part of Michigan. They call it the Upper Peninsula, because remember, a peninsula is a piece of land that is surrounded on three sides by a body of water. So this is part of Michigan, even though it doesn't actually touch, but it is part of Michigan. And then we have some national forests along southern Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, and then up in the northern part of I think they call it the Lower Peninsula of Michigan, because the state of Michigan has two peninsulas. We have this part, which they say looks kind of like a hand, a mitten, and then we have the Upper Peninsula, which is also surrounded on three sides. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to page 246, and then go ahead and read with me. As we go, we will be writing definitions, so make sure you also have your vocabulary notebook open to a clean page in the social studies section. Okay, so at the top of your clean page in your social studies section, you need to title your vocabulary with Chapter 8, Lesson 1, and then make sure that you have today's date. Okay, so this is all about the geography of the Midwest. Remember, we learned geography is the study of land. So this is going to be mostly about the land, what we see, what we find in the Great Lakes, and how people use it. I'm sorry, not the Great Lakes, the Midwest. I might say that a few times, but I mean the Midwest. Okay, we're on page 246. Read with me while I read out loud. Geography of the Midwest. It's still dark outside, or you are there. It's still dark outside when you crawl out of bed, but you're used to that. During harvest time, you always help out on the weekends. Let's go, your dad yells over the sound of the combine's engine. You climb into the cab of the huge harvesting machine. It's already hot outside, so the air conditioning feels good. You sing along with your favorite song as your dad steers the combine toward the field. Rows of tall, ripe corn stretch to the horizon. You have a lot of work to do today. So by reading that you are there, we can see it's talking about farming. The reason that they're doing that is that farming is a major source of money in the Midwest. We'll find out why when we keep reading. Great Lakes to Great Plains. Fields of corn, wheat, and other crops are common sights in the Midwest. The interior plains are the main reason why. These flat, fertile plains cover the entire Midwest region. So like we were talking about when we were looking at the map, we can see that most of the Midwest is very flat. That's because all of the Midwest is in the interior plains. There are some places where there are some mountains and some forests and some plateaus, but they're not very big. Most of the Midwest is just plains. And so we know that plains are flat, grassy areas. So grassy means it's pretty fertile. So what a lot of people have done back since people first started exploring is they find a large plot of land, mow all the grass or get rid of all the grass because they didn't have lawnmowers back then, and then they used it to plant crops, shaping the plains. The interior plains formed thousands of years ago. They took shape as glaciers pushed south over North America. As the glaciers moved, they flattened hills and filled in valleys. We learned about that with the Northeast, where they caused and the Southeast too, I think, where they caused those basins that then filled with water. And they also, in the Southeast, they kind of made that soil very fertile. They kind of took the rocky soil away as they moved across and left fertile soil behind. Glaciers also formed the region's Great Lakes. They carved out 5 huge holes in low areas. Then the climate warmed. The melted ice from glaciers slowly filled the holes. Again, we learned about that with the Northeast and the Southeast. I think it was mostly the Northeast, where they carved out those big basins. The glaciers carved out those big basins. Then they melted and filled them with water, creating lakes. A sea of grass. As the climate warmed, miles and miles of prairie were left in the interior plains. A prairie is an area of flat or rolling land covered mostly with grasses and wildflowers. So that's our first vocabulary word, but I just want to tell you what they mean by rolling. They don't mean it's actually spinning. It just means there are some hills. If you've ever driven through Nebraska or Kansas or Oklahoma, you'll notice that almost your entire drive you can see for miles. But you do see some hills where it just rolls. You can still plant on hills. It's the mountains that you cannot plant on. So even though it's not entirely flat, they do have some hills, you can still easily plant crops. So our first word is the word prairie. Oops, yes, no, I'm right. P-R-A-I-R-I-E. And a prairie is an area of flat or rolling, which means hilly, or rolling land covered with grass or wildflowers. We see some what looks like prairies even here, but the Midwest has a lot of prairies. Much of its land is, or at one time, was a prairie. When early settlers saw the Central Plains, or the eastern part of the interior plains, so remember the Central Plains is part of the interior plains, it's just to the east, it's closer to the Atlantic Ocean. They described it as a sea of grass. That is because the prairie grasses grew very tall. However, on the drier Great Plains to the west, the prairie grasses did not grow as tall. So remember, I wish if you were here I'd show you on the map, but that would just be, well, you know what, I'll just move the iPad. So, remember, the interior plains and the Great Plains are both, the Central Plains and the Great Plains are both part of the interior plains. Remember, the interior plains are the whole middle part of the country. The Central Plains are over here on this side, and the Great Plains are over here to the west. But they are all part of the interior plains, which covers most of the Midwest. Oops. So now let's get back to the book. And let's keep reading. Today, crops such as corn and wheat have replaced most of the tall grass prairies in the Midwest. The fertile soil that once helped the grasses grow now helps crops to grow. So, the Midwest used to be almost entirely covered in prairies. Now, a lot of those prairies have been converted to farms because the fertile soil that allowed all that grass and those wildflowers to grow also allows crops to grow. So now we're going to do this reading check question. We're going to do it the same exact way that we did the quick check in science. So I'm going to ask the question. You're going to pause the video and write your answer in your notebook underneath the definition we just did. And then you're going to play the video and check your answer. So make sure you are writing your answer. If you are correct, awesome. If you are incorrect, use your pencil to correct it. So the question is, how would you describe the geography of the Midwest? So that means you need to say all of the geographic landforms that we see in the Midwest. So go ahead and do that now, and then play the video to see if you're correct. Okay, so the answer is the Midwest is a region of lakes, prairies, and farms. That's what we mostly find. Again, there are some hills, some mountains, but it's mostly, there are lots of hills, but there are some mountains and some forests, but it is mostly an area with lots of lakes, lots of prairies, which have been turned into farms, and then of course farms. So make sure you have those answers. Now let's look at the caption at the bottom. We have a picture of a prairie. We see all this grass and the wildflowers. We see the little yellow wildflowers in there as well. And it says, corn, which is in that smaller inset picture of that man, and other crops have replaced most prairies in the Midwest. The few prairies that still exist often lie in protected areas, such as Nachusa grassland in Illinois. So, most of these prairies, like we see at the bottom of page 247, have been replaced by farms, which we see in the inset picture. That means the smaller picture that is inside on page 246. But there are still some protected grasslands and prairies in certain states. Like they mentioned one in Illinois. I've been to one in, I think it was Oklahoma, which was pretty cool. It was just a really big field that looked kind of like this, but now it's protected so that nobody can come in and farm on it, which we do need. We need areas that are protected, that can't be used, otherwise we won't have any prairies. And think about all the good prairies do. I mean, there's lots of plants for photosynthesis. They don't really use they don't need to use chemicals or fertilizers or anything to help the grass grow. It just does it naturally. Okay, go ahead and turn the page. And now we're going to read about climate. Remember, climate is weather. In the Midwest, the climate gets drier as you move from east to west. As a result, taller grasses and more trees grow on the Central Plains than on the Great Plains. So as you move from east, closer to Tennessee and the Atlantic Ocean, towards California and the Pacific Ocean, it gets drier, so the grass does not grow as tall. Winds from the north and south. The entire region shares some climate features. The Midwest is located far from the oceans. We know that because it's right in the middle. There's lots of land on either side of it. And there's Mexico to the south, and the Mexico in the southeast to the south, and then there's Canada to the north. So it's very far from all oceans and large bodies of water. As a result, strong winds off the oceans cannot reach the region from east or west. However, strong winds blowing from north and south do reach the region. In summer, warm, moist air flows north from the Gulf of Mexico. It brings hot, rainy weather. Remember, to the south we have the equator, and to the north we have the pole. So that means wind coming from the south is going to be warmer. Also, it's coming in the summer, it's coming from the Gulf of Mexico, which means it is more humid, it is wetter, so it's going to rain more, it's more wet. In winter, cold air moves south from Canada. It can bring snowstorms and hailstorms. That's why the Midwest is kind of weird. Like here, we have a very temperate. It doesn't get too hot, it doesn't get too cold. But in the Midwest, because of the wind coming from the south, it gets really, really hot in the summer. But then the wind coming from the north, from Canada, because of where it's situated, gets really, really cold, so they get a whole lot of snow. So they have very different summers and winters, whereas ours, it does get really hot, but it never really gets that cold, at least not for long periods of time in the winter. The lake effect. The Great Lakes affect the areas that border them. These large bodies of water absorb heat in summer. They release this heat in winter. Even so, the surface of the Great Lakes can freeze in the coldest months. Also in winter, cold winds pick up moisture from the lakes. The moisture causes snowfall to be heavier in some nearby areas. This event is known as the lake effect. In Chicago, it snows a lot, and they get feet and feet of snow sometimes because of the lake effect, because of the wind blowing off that water. So there's a lot of moisture in that wind, which as it comes to the land, turns into snow. Let's look at the picture down at the bottom. It says, the Great Lakes. A boy and his father, below, ice fish on one of the 5 Great Lakes. The image at left shows the lakes from space. So it's really funny because this boy and his dad are actually on the lake. Like they are on the frozen water. They have walked from the shore across much of the water, and then they drilled a hole, or they cut a hole into the ice, and then they are fishing through it. But they are actually sitting on the ice right now. That's how thick the ice on the Great Lakes can get. I mean, they may have like several feet of ice between them and the water, so it's definitely strong enough to hold them. Some people will even drive and create little huts on top of the ice just to ice fish. Let's keep reading. Earth's strongest winds. When masses of warm air and cold air meet over the flat interior plains, tornadoes can form. A tornado is a funnel-shaped spinning windstorm. So that's our next word. So you should put it underneath your answer to the reading check from page 247. And our word is tornado. And a tornado is a funnel-shaped spinning windstorm. Notice that I have this comma between the 2 adjectives describing the wind form, because we can do that instead of the word and when we only have 2, or maybe 3 descriptions. We can just use a comma, a funnel-shaped spinning windstorm. Tornadoes are common in the Midwest in spring and summer. They move over the land quickly, often destroying everything in their paths. At the center of some tornadoes, wind speeds can reach more than 300 miles per hour. After a tornado struck his community, one Ohio resident said, "Just a few hours ago, this was a nice, quiet, suburban neighborhood. Now it looks like a war zone." We've had a lot of tornadoes recently, not here, but in areas around us. So we've seen on the news all the damage that a tornado can cause. A tornado they can cause so much damage. But it's a little different from a hurricane because the area that they hit is much smaller. A hurricane is massive, a massive, massive windstorm. A tornado is a funnel shape, so it mostly just affects the area that it goes along. So you can see a tornado go through a town, and you can see where one house is completely destroyed, but the houses on either side of it might only have some of their shingles torn off or some siding torn off. That's what's crazy about a tornado. It goes along a path, a small path, and anything in its path can be completely destroyed. Let's look at the picture at the top of the tornado and let's read about it. A powerful tornado or twister moves across an area of the Great Plains known as Tornado Alley. They call that area Tornado Alley because it's very, very flat. Now tornadoes, what they can do is as they go up a hill, sometimes they don't come down right away. They go up and then they might stay a little while and then they might come down. So this flat area of the Great Plains where there really are no hills that are big enough for that to happen, causes that tornado to just have a straight path that it can travel. Now let's read about dry times. Droughts are another danger in the Midwest. A drought is a long period of little or no rain. So our third word is the word drought. And a drought is a long period of little or no rain. Now, when it says a long period, it doesn't mean a few days. It doesn't even mean a few weeks. It doesn't even mean just 1 month. A drought would happen with little or no rain over months and months and months. And even in some places, mostly not in the United States, but in places in other countries, even for years, droughts can continue. In the 1930s, the southern Great Plains had the worst drought in the history of the United States. For nearly 10 years, there was too little rain for farmers to grow crops there. Think about back in the 1930s. They did not have plumbing the way that we do now. So now farmers do need rain, but they also have the plumbing needed in order to bring water in, either from other bodies of water or from down under the ground, or from where they have stored it from other rainstorms. But back then they didn't have that technology, so they had to have rain. And if there was no rain, they couldn't water their crops. So if it hasn't rained for 10 years, think about what happened to all those crops. Crops start to die without water after a few days of not being watered. So imagine 10 years. The drought caused the soil to dry up. Then, strong winds blew the dry soil away in huge dust storms. These storms filled homes with dirt and destroyed farms. The entire area became known as the Dust Bowl because it was kind of like almost a little basin where it was so dry and windy because they still had those winds blowing across the plains without hills or mountains to stop it, that would kick up that dry soil and get it everywhere. Into houses, all over people. If you look up pictures of the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, you'll see people covered in dirt just walking around outside. It was really crazy. Okay, so now we're going to do this reading check. Make sure that you put your answer in your textbook. Your answer in your notebook underneath the definition for drought. So again, I'll ask the question, you pause the video, write your answer in your notebook underneath the word drought, and then play it to check your answer. The question is, what happened during the worst drought in the history of the United States? Well, the answer is the soil dried up, wind blew it away in dust storms. Also, so the dust storms filled houses with dirt and it destroyed farms because nobody could keep the dust away from covering up the crops, and there was no water even to water the crops. So make sure you have an answer that sounds kind of like that. And then let's move on. Natural resources. So after we read this, we're going to look at the land use and resource map. So make sure that you're ready for that. Natural resources. People use most of the Midwest land for farming and ranching. The Midwest is one of the nation's major agricultural regions. Remember, agricultural has to do, that's a vocabulary, that's an adjective that means having to do with farming. Land resources. The climate and soil of the Central Plains are perfect for growing crops. Corn has long been an important crop. In fact, much of the region is known as the Corn Belt. Farmers there grow soybeans too. In the Great Plains, remember that's the part of the interior plains that's to the west, more towards the Pacific Ocean. Not near the Pacific Ocean, but just moving towards it. In the Great Plains, the drier climate and harder soil are good for growing wheat. Most of this wheat is used to make flour. Because of this, the Great Plains are sometimes called America's breadbasket. So we've got the Central Plains, which is sometimes called the Corn Belt, and then we've got the Great Plains, which is called sometimes America's breadbasket. Raising livestock is also important in the region. On the Central Plains, farmers raise dairy cows in the valleys of Wisconsin and Minnesota. On the Great Plains, ranching is an important industry. Ranching is especially important in Kansas and Nebraska. Cattle and sheep graze on land that is too dry for farming. So it's too dry for farming. That means they can't plant crops there. There's not enough moisture in the dirt. So instead, they will have animals, because animals and livestock don't really need wet or moist ground. They can do just fine because the farmers can feed them if the grass won't grow well. The farmers now can feed them, and they don't really need all of the plants and everything that, or the nutrients in the soil that crops need. The Midwest has other resources too. In forested areas, such as South Dakota's Black Hills, workers produce lumber. Workers in the region also mine for minerals. Much of the nation's iron ore comes from the Midwest. Ore is a rock that has one or more kinds of minerals. So number 4, which goes underneath the answer to your reading check on page 249. Our next word is ore. And ore is a rock that has one or more minerals. So that means ore is not just made up of iron, or not just made up of coal or lead or zinc or any of those other metals. It has more than one mineral in it. It's a mixture. The region also has oil. Kansas and Illinois are 2 of the top 10 oil-producing states. So if you drive across Kansas and Illinois, you'll see those little things where they go like up and down. I'm not describing them well. But I think they're called oil derricks, if you Google that. And you'll look them up, and they kind of have this arm on them that swings up and down. There's like a little base over here, and it swings up and down on that base. And you'll see a rod that goes from one side down into the ground. That is pulling the oil up and out of the ground. You'll see a lot of those in Kansas and Illinois. So we have learned from this section that up in the northwest part, in like South Dakota and North Dakota, it is more forested, and it is more, it's more mountainous. So they are able to mine things there, and they're also able to use them for lumber. Whereas the rest of it is more used, the Central Plains have very fertile ground, so there's a lot of farming of crops that goes on, and part of the Great Plains as well, whereas the rest of the Great Plains is a little too dry for crop farming, so they have a lot more animals and livestock. Let's read about water resources, and then we'll go ahead and talk about the land use and resource map. Water resources. The Midwest also has valuable water resources. Now, you may not think that because there's not much water in the Midwest, but we'll keep reading to find out why that is. People fish in and use the water from the region's rivers. There are a lot of rivers in this region. These include the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers. The Great Lakes also provide for people's needs. The lakes contain nearly 1/5 of the world's fresh surface water. So that means in the whole world, 1/5 of the fresh water, not the salt water like the oceans, but the fresh water is in the Great Lakes. Okay, so let's look at this. We'll look at this land use and resource map, then we'll do the reading check, then we'll read the summary. So let's look at this land use and resource map. Remember, the colors tell us how the land is used. So the colors mean somebody else, human beings, have to go and do something to get something out of the land. These symbols are the natural resources. So those are what people can go and get from the land. Nobody has to make these things. The land uses, the colors, people have to do something for this to work. For them to be used in this way. These symbols, however, mean people can go in and get it, and it's already there. So if we look at this map, it says the Midwest is rich in natural resources. In fact, South Dakota has the largest gold mine in the country. What is the main land use for most of North Dakota? Well, let's look. Remember, for land use, we are going to use the colors. We're going to look at the colors. Now, you should know where North Dakota is because this map does only have the abbreviations, but remember we had that states and abbreviations test. So find North Dakota, and then find what color most of the land is. Well, most of the land is that tannish brown color, which means that most of North Dakota's land is used to grow wheat and grain. We also see a lot of green, which means it's also used for general farming, but mostly for farming wheat and grain. We see a little bit of yellow, which means part of it, a little bit, is used for cattle, sheep, and hogs. So that's ranching. Remember, ranching is kind of like farming, but it's with animals, whereas farming is with crops. Okay, so let's see. Let's look at the whole Midwest. And let's think, what is the main use of the land in the Midwest? So we're looking for the color that we see the most. And really what I see the most is green. So that means most of the Midwest is used for general farming. There is a large piece that from going up from Lake Michigan up to Canada that is orange, which means it's used for dairy farming. There's quite a bit that is tan, which means it's used for growing wheat and grain, and there's quite a bit that is yellow, which means it's used for ranching cattle, sheep, and hogs. But most of it is used for general farming. Sorry. We see a little bit of the dark green up in northern Michigan and Minnesota that's used for forest, but there's not a whole lot of land used for lumber or harvesting from forests because there isn't a whole lot of forest in the Midwest. But we do see it in areas that are close to other regions. Like we see it close to the border of Canada, and we see it close down at the bottom, close to the border of the Southeast, because those areas do have a lot more trees. We don't see very much going towards the west, because again, once we move into the West, we'll find out that, especially in the eastern part of the West, there's not a whole lot of trees. It's very similar to the Midwest, just the eastern part of the West, not the whole thing. Let's see, I see a lot of the symbol for oil or natural gas. And we learn that the Midwest is a very high producer of oil, especially the states of Kansas and Illinois, which we can see a whole lot of those little oil symbols. We do see some land that's used for manufacturing. Remember, most of the time when we look at these maps, we see manufacturing focused around the cities. Because remember, if manufacturing means factories, and what do factories need in order for them to work? They need people. Where do most of the people live? In or near the cities. So that's why most of these big cities have pink for manufacturing around them, because that's where a lot of the manufacturing happens. We do see tiny little pieces of land in southern Missouri and western Michigan that are used for fruits and vegetables. But as we can see, the Midwest is not a major source of lumber or fruits and vegetables. It is a major source of other crops and of livestock and of wheat and grain. We see it's a major source of oil. I think this is the most oil we've seen on any of these land use and resource maps that we've seen so far. And then probably the next most common resource is lead. So there's a lot of lead, or is that coal? Sorry. Coal, I can't really read it, it's very small. Coal that comes from the Midwest. And actually, something that might be surprising to you, there's a lot of gold in the Midwest. That's why back in the mid 1800s, there was a big gold rush where people moved from the eastern parts of the country towards the west because they had heard there was a lot of gold. And we can see there is quite a bit of gold in the Midwest. I think we'll actually learn more about the gold rush in the next, in lesson 2. Okay, so just you can take some time to study that land use and resource map, look at what you can find, see if you find anything that you think is really interesting or something that you wouldn't expect. And then you can do that after we're done with the lesson. So now let's do the reading check. So again, I'll ask the question, you pause the video, answer the question underneath your definition for or, and then play the video to see if you're correct. So besides land used for farming and ranching, what other resources are found in the region? So this is where you can study that map and you can just list them. Okay, so some other resources are forests, minerals such as ore, oil, rivers, and lakes. Okay, now let's read the summary, and then we are done with this lesson. Fertile plains make the Midwest a major agricultural region. Corn and wheat are two leading crops. Because of its location, the Midwest can face extreme weather, such as tornadoes. And we also learned about droughts, which is almost the opposite. No weather, just hot and dry. Okay, so what I want you to do now is, that's it for the lesson. You don't have any independent practice for social studies. You do have homework, however. So get out your packet, and the very last page of the packet is your homework. You can do that now, or you can wait till later. This is one of those sheets where you read the sentence, and then you circle the word on either side of this dash that makes it true. So number 1, is it a drought? Is it a drought is an area of flat or rolling land covered mostly with grasses and wildflowers? Or is it a prairie is an area of flat or rolling land covered mostly with grasses and wildflowers? So you are going to circle the word or the phrase on either side of the dash that makes the sentence make sense. Okay, that's it for social studies. If you have any questions, reach out to me today between 1 and 5, and I'll help you out.